Hi, I'm Peter Andras and I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 2, Definition of Systems, and part 1 of lecture 2. In this part, we look at examples of systems and we consider a couple of fundamental concepts of how we see complex systems in this context. So let's start with a couple of examples. So first, let's consider the biological cell. What you see on the screen on one side is a kind of traditional description showing various components of the cell, including the nucleus, the various cellular organelles like mitochondria, the nuclear envelope, and so on. On the other side, what you see is a diagram of interactions between enzymes, which produce further molecules in the cell and deliver some functionality in the context of the cell. So on one side, what you see is a complex cellular organism with various components. On the other side, it is a much more schematic representation of how this complex cell delivers its behaviors through interaction of molecules, and in particular of enzymes and other molecules. So on one side, you can describe the cell by describing the various components, how they behave, where they are, how they relate to various other parts of the cell. On the other side, perhaps a more systematic, but perhaps less obviously transparent description of the cell you can get by describing it as a system of interacting proteins and other molecules. So these two descriptions are equivalent, but the second, the description as a system of interactions of proteins, in a sense is more abstract, but also captures more clearly what is actually happening in the cell. Now let's look at another system. This is the medusa, a filter feeder organism with a number of tissues and organs. Now recently it has been shown that it has in the range of a few tens of different cell kinds and different tissues in this organism. Now here what we see is that, again, you can describe the pictures that you see on the screen by describing what are the components of these organisms, how they behave, how they feed, how they multiply, and so on. On the other side, you can look at the cells in these organisms and describe what kind of cells are there and how these cells interact to form tissues and organs. Look at the mouse. That's a much more complex organism compared to the filter feeder medusa. But again, here, what you can describe are the many different kinds of components of the mouse as functional components of this biological organism. Or alternatively, you can describe what kind of cells are there in this organism, how do they interact. Now, clearly what you can see is that while in the filter feeder organism, you have in the range of few tens, something like 30, 40 different kinds of cells, forming a range of different kinds of tissues. In the mouse, even just if you consider the brain of the mouse, you have hundreds and perhaps thousands of different kinds of cells. So it is a much more complex organism than the filter feeder medusa. But ultimately, in a kind of abstract sense, what you see is that you can describe it by considering the range of cell types, how these cells interact with other cells to form the tissues and the organs of the mouse. Now let's consider some component of these organisms, the nervous system in particular. Now, the nervous system is a vast network of specialized cells, these are the neurons, that deal with information in the organism. Now, in the medusa, it's a much simpler system of nerve rings and neurons across the body. In the mouse, It is a much more complex, much more organized system, the nervous system, with a brain, a spinal cord, and many other localized neural components, ganglia, and so on. And if you look inside of the brain, it is hugely complexly organized system. Now, this system deals with getting information in from the outside, processing it, and generating somehow the controls that drive the behavior of the organism. Now, again, what you can highlight in this system is that there are these many neurons, relatively similar cells, which interact with each other, and through these interactions they manage the information. So again, what I would highlight here is that you have a large number of relatively similar cells organized in many complex hierarchical networks and recurrent networks and so on, which deliver their function of information processing and gathering and controlling, gathering of information and controlling the body of the organism through these many interactions between the neurons. Now, if you consider an even more, perhaps more complex, more abstract system, it's the conscious self. So the self is really about communicating about the identity of the self. Certainly it happens in humans, and to some extent there is evidence that some equivalent system happens at least in some animals as well. In humans we understand it much more clearly, and although the understanding is still relatively vague in terms of understanding of how and in what way this conscious self is constructed through the activity in the brain. But certainly what we can describe about it is that it is a communication system. About the self communicates about itself, checks what constitutes the identity of the self, checks what is different from the supposed identity of the system. What are these differences, dissonances between the actual behaviors of the individual and their identity, and how these differences can be resolved. This all happens inside of our head, in our brain, and we construct this identity through these communications about ourselves, within ourselves. Now look at a social organization, an ant colony. So here you have many individual ants which act together in a complex but organized way. They build huge ant colonies. They manage food in these colonies. Some of them grow fungi. Some of them cultivate other small insects on the leaves of plants to derive their nutrient-rich food. So it is a complex organization, social organization of relatively simple insects. Of course, you can again describe this by describing how the different kinds of ants, different castes of ants are organized, how they organize their mount, how they organize their offspring management, the managing of their food, and so on. What is also clear that all this happens through the interactions of individual ants. And at least in some abstract way, you can see that actually all these variety of behavior which delivers the functionality of an ant colony can be described through the interactions of ants and patterns of these interactions. Now let's look at an even more complex social system, the political system. Here you see some pictures of recent British politicians. Recent meaning last 40 years or so. Now, The political system is part of the human social system, and it is in particular the part that deals with power, with the distribution of power and the use of power in a society to decide on many things, in particular resource distributions, but many other things uh, within the human society. Again, if you look at the political system, what you see is that it is made of human communications. Again, you can describe the various institutions, the parties, the government, the elections, the constitutional court, and so on, depending on the country and how the political system is organized. But this functional description, while provides you a good picture and perhaps really covering almost fully the political system, it is, in a sense, quite varied and perhaps harder to understand in terms of mechanisms. However, if you look at the political system from the perspective of human communications, what kind of patterns of communications you have, how these communications build into these patterns, and how these patterns determine the flow of power, the practice of power, then you get an alternative description of the political system. So on one side, you have this description of the functional components. On the other side, you have a description of how the communications work between humans who are participating in the political system and how this participation, these communications, build and constitute the political system itself. Now, let's move further into technological system. Consider the Windows operating system. It's very commonly used across the world. It is a large software system with many processes inside, which go on all time. Now, actually, if you look at the Windows itself, there are at least hundreds and typically thousands of different processes which work in parallel across time and deliver the functionality of the Windows operating system to your computer. So again, on one side, you can see, for example, the listing of the code, which describes how this operating system is built. It takes probably millions of lines of codes to describe exactly what the Windows operating system does. At the same time, an alternative view is that you can describe how these various processes communicate with each other. So again, you can see the Windows operating system both as a kind of large-scale functional system which makes your computer work, delivers its services, manages the screen, the keyboard, the mouse, the disk, connects you to the internet, manages the files, and so on. So this is the functionality of the Windows. On the other side, of course, you have the code, but that's so long that it's really difficult. It would be extremely difficult to understand for a single person. But the alternative in between the description is a description of how these various processes interact with each other. And clearly, that is kind of sufficiently abstract description that captures, if you like, really everything, at least in principle, in how the Windows operating system works. So, what we have seen so far are a number of examples of systems, starting from the cells to social organisms and the technological systems, such as the Windows operating system. And in all cases, what we have seen is that you can describe the system as a kind of abstract communication system, where there are components which interact with each other, and through these many communications, the system behavior and functionality is delivered. So let's see these concepts in a kind of more abstract way, where going abstract helps to understand what is the core, most important feature of these components. So let's start with the concept of the communication. On one side, you have a sender. On the other side, you have a receiver. And in between them, there is a signal. So in general, in all these cases that we consider, there is a sender, a receiver, and a signal that is sent between them. So, for example, if you look at molecules, there are molecules that interact, and through this interaction, the signal is delivered between them. Or between neurons, the signal is clearly delivered by the activity of these neurons, which impact on other neurons. Or in humans, in the political systems, politicians talk to each other, and those communications deliver the communication in the context of this system. So in general, you have the sender, the receiver, and the signal in between them. Now, what is very important to note is that the sender and receiver are communication units that can send and receive signals. And the key feature is that they communicate with each other through these signals. So in a sense, we really ignore what happens inside of these communication units, be themselves, humans, and so on, or components of the Windows operating system. What matters from our perspective is that these are communications that can send and receive signals. And we focus on this feature of them. So for example, if you consider two mobile phones, it doesn't exactly matter, and we don't really care about what kind of complex electronics is packaged into these mobile phones. What matters is that they can send signals in between them, and they can send and receive these signals. Now, the signal itself, it's very important to look at what does that mean. So, the signal is a behavior or a state of the sender communication unit that somehow is mediated to the receiver. So, for example, if you look at the mobile phones, they generate electromagnetic waves, modulations of these electromagnetic waves, and that's what is passed through the mediator environment to the other phone. In the case of human communications by speech, we modulate the vibrations in the air, and the air transmits these vibrations into the ear of another human, where they modulate their eardrum and deliver the communication. So the signal transmission happens by generating a signal by the sender, reception of the signal by the receiver, and the transmission, which may involve some deterioration of the communication through the transmission medium. So if you take the mobile phones, yes, you can use them, but you can hear noise through it. If you look at communications between humans, yes, you can talk to another human, but there might be noise. If you talk through air, that's works in one way. If you try to do the same in water, it's quite different. In the same way, the communications between cells or ants or and so on may differ, and the transmission may interfere with the communication, but essentially in all cases what you can see is that there is a sender, the receiver, and the signal that is generated by the sender. It is transmitted through transmission media to the receiver, which receives the signal. So this is really the most important here, is that we have a sender unit, a receiver unit, and a communication between them. The signals are generated by the sender, they are transmitted through the communication medium, and they are received by the receiver. So this is really the abstract essence of the communication that we are talking about, that we have a sender unit, a receiver unit. Both are communication units, and they generate a communication between them. And we really don't care about what's inside of these units, the sender and the receiver units, how they do this behavior of communication. What we are focusing on is that these units are able to generate this communication, and the communication is transmitted between them. Now, clearly, this is a very simple approach and picks one key element of communications. We don't talk about meaning of communication, the structure of communication, what is a sequence of signals or patterns of signals. So, for example, if you look at human speech, there is a sequence of phonemes that are communicated. Each phoneme has a pattern of vibrations or vibration modulations. So it has a quite complex structure. However, so far we are not looking at that. We are really just focusing on the core feature of communication, where you have the communication units, which are seen as abstract communication units, focused only on the feature that they can communicate and the communication in between them. So, in these lectures that we have here, we consider the systems as communication systems. So all systems that we talk about are the communication systems. And these systems are the communications that are generated between a set of communication units. So these communication units exchange communications, and the communications exchanged between them form the system itself. So all the systems that we will consider will be seen as such communication systems, and we may also call them abstract communication systems, because we are focusing on an abstract level of communications between these communication units. So, for example, if you consider the nervous system, then you can see the neurons as the communication units, and really the question is, what kind of communication, what kind of signal transmission happens between the neurons? And we see the nervous system as a system of those communications. In the ant colony, you have the ants as the communication units, and their interactions are the communications. And again, the system, the ant colony system, is the system of these interactions between the ants. Or in the Windows operating system, again, focusing on the communications, yes, you have the many processes which compose the Windows operating system. But really the question is how these components interact. And those interactions deliver the functionality of the system and the system itself. So here, what you see on the screen just emphasizes this, that you have the abstract communication units, the purple squares, and you have the communications in between them. These are the arrows. And the red surround line surrounds the system itself. As you see, the communication units themselves are not in the system, because the system, it is the system of the communications between them. The communication units are outside of this system. They contribute to the system by generating the communications. But the system itself is made of these communications, which happen between the communication units. This also means that communication units can be replaced while the system is maintained. And quite often you will see, as we discuss the various systems in the further lectures, this is indeed the case, that communication units disappear or get changed, but the system itself is maintained and is sustained. So just think, for example, many of our cells actually die. It's most obvious when you look at your skin, which we shed regularly. Now, these dying cells means that they are replaced, and these new cells deliver the same functionality in some sense as a system. So overall, the system is the same, but the communication units are different. Same applies, for example, in the context of the cells. The individual molecules are functional for a while, and then they get decomposed and recycled. But the overall functionality of the system stays. Or ants die, or humans may get in and out of the political system, but the system itself is maintained as a system of communications, where the communication units may change around the system. Now, so far we defined what we mean by communication systems, or systems in short. Let's consider what's outside of the system. So what's the system's environment? Now here on the screen you see two pictures of of cells. One is a close-up picture taken with an electron microscope. The other is a kind of more distant picture where you see the cell in the middle, the kind of dark spot in the yellowish environment. Now, in both cases, what you can see is that there is a boundary of the cell. On the image on the left, you see the nucleus of the cell quite clearly having a boundary, and then around it there is the cell, and there is a boundary which sees some parts of the cell membrane. On the picture on the right side, you see more clearly the various appendages of the cell, and clearly there is a distinction between what's in the cell and outside of the cell. So what's outside of the cell, that's the cell's environment. And in general, outside of a system is the collection of all communications that happens outside of the system. So inside of the system you have communications that compose the system, but there are many other communications, other kinds of communications that happen which are not in the system. And these all together, the outside of the system, composes the environment of the system. Now, in the case of the cells, it was relatively clear, at least on the pictures, of seeing where are these boundaries. However, in general, we can define the boundary in the sense that we consider the communications that are inside of the cell system and those which are outside, and those outside constitute the environment of the system. So take again the example of the mobile phones. You may have satellite TV signals around you, or you may have a radio, so a lot of electromagnetic waves are around, but only those are picked up which are appropriate for the mobile phone. And you may get some interference with the others, but most of these other communications around it will not affect the mobile phone and the system of communications between mobile phones. So, in general, the environment is everything that is not the system. So, every communication outside of the system constitutes the environment. So, for example, in the case of a cell, you have the interactions between molecules which happen inside of the cell, and you have many other molecular interactions that happen outside of the cell. And there is a distinction. Those which happen inside the cell, those form the cell as a system, and those which happen outside of the cell, those are part of the cell's environment. As I said, sometimes it's relatively clear, at least in some way, of visualization of where is this boundary which defines what's the environment and what's the system. But in general, this boundary is defined by what communications are within the system and which are not. Now, let's have a closer look at the cell membrane. So what you see here is a representation of the cell membrane. Perhaps, as you know, it's made of lipid molecules. It's a lipid bilayer, which separates the inside of the cell from the outside. However, in this lipid bilayer, there are a number of molecules, typically proteins, which cross through the cell membrane. They have parts which are outside of the cell, they have parts inside of the cell, and most of them are across the cell membrane. So the question is, where is now the boundary? Now, at this close-up, you can see that the boundary is a bit less obvious. In the same way as in the pictures of the cell, the two pictures, the close-up picture, it was clear that there is the boundary, but it was less clear where you end with the cell. While in the kind of more distant picture, it was more clear. Now, if you take this close-up, then the question is, how do you define what's inside of the cell and what's outside of the cell? Especially given that you have these molecules which cross through the cell membrane and have both inside and outside parts. So here, what we can look at is that how are these molecular interactions? How are the communications? How many communications are there? And in general, what you expect is that within the system, you will have many communications following the system's rule, if you like. While outside of the system, there will be communications, but there will be fewer. So essentially, how you can define perhaps a more abstract but more clear way of where is the boundary between the system and the environment is this kind of density boundary. So you have many communications within the system, and you have much less dense communications outside of the system. So what you see here on the screen, there is the system in the middle, surrounded by the red line, and you see that there are many communications represented there. And there are communications outside of the system as well, but they are fewer. So in general, for any of these communication systems, what we can see is that there is this density boundary. Many communications happening at the same time inside of the system, and much fewer communications happening at the same time outside of the system, outside of the boundary. Now, it's also important to know that this boundary may change. The system may grow, may shrink, but there is always a boundary which can be seen in terms of this uh, density or frequency of communications. So, to summarize, first we looked at communication systems and the concept of the communications. And we said that in all the systems that we consider, we have communication units which should be seen abstractly, focusing on their ability to generate and receive these communications. And the communication is passed between these communication units through some communication medium, which may interfere with the communication itself and may alter what is communicated. But essentially, the key element here is that you have these abstract communication units which can generate and receive and pass on between them the communications. And we defined the systems as systems of communications where the communication units themselves which contribute these communications are not part of the system. Then we looked at the environment and we said that everything outside of the system is part of the environment. And then we looked at how can we decide what's inside and outside of the system. And then we came up with the idea of the system boundary defined in terms of frequency or a density of communications. And we said that systems are dense communication, many high frequent communications between the communications, and outside of them there are much less frequent, much less dense communications. And this density boundary defines where is the boundary of the system, what's inside of the system and what's outside of the system. Again, you have to see this is quite abstract definition because we didn't really talk about how we measure these communications. It is at this stage, it is relative abstract visualization of how these communications happens and how this boundary is defined in terms of density or frequency of communications. Right, so let's see a few questions and answers. So first question, is it true that the economy of North Tyneside forms a separate system, and why? So now North Tyneside, this is a small part of England, in the northeast of England. And the question is this forming a separate system? And well, in a sense, yes, there are interactions between the people and the companies based in the North Tyneside. Naturally, there is a relatively dense interaction between them because they are co-located. However, actually, if you look at most of the companies, the clients and suppliers are most likely to be outside of this relatively small area. So, in effect, although there are many interactions locally, because people live locally, overall, it is not necessarily a clear density or frequency boundary around the communication. There are many, many communications with companies and people outside of North Tyneside. So in that sense, we would not see this as a separate system for this reason. Second question is it true that sodium ions are part of a cell even outside of the cell membrane? Well, sodium ions are passed across the cell membrane, and when they are inside of the cell, they contribute in a number of ways to the functioning of the cell. For example, they may create or they may contribute to the creation of a potential difference between what's inside of the cell, what's outside of the cell, or they may contribute to be parts of certain molecules or interact with certain molecules. The question is, if a sodium ion is outside of the cell, is that part of the cell or not? And well, in general, the question is this ion really interacting with other molecules in the cell? If it does, then it would be part of the cell as a system. However, most likely, sodium ions outside of the cell will not be interacting with the ion channel molecules which transport sodium ions, or at least most of them would not. So although some sodium ions might interact with the cell proteins that transport the sodium ions, most of them will not. So most of them will not be part of the cell. Third question is it true that this lecture is part of the environment for the UK political system? And clearly, UK political system is there. This is about politics in the UK, about how the power is used, for example, how is inflation managed, or what kind of legislation is about labor organization, about how the BBC is funded and so on. Many number of questions are managed and through political decisions. This lecture has largely very little to do with that political system. Yes, indeed, somebody may listen to this lecture who might be a politician, may impact on their behavior or views what they hear here. However, these are very unlikely events, and it's most likely this lecture has no interaction or very insignificant interaction with any part of the UK political system. So indeed, this lecture is part of the environment of the UK political system.